They called it the summer that never cooled, when the air itself seemed to spoil. In 1840, deep in the marshlands of rural Georgia, the Holloway estate stood like a monument to Southern grace. White columns, silk drapes, and servants who moved like ghosts beneath chandeliers. To outsiders, it was a home of refinement. To those within, it was a house already beginning to rot. When Mary Ann Holt arrived from Savannah, she brought with her nothing but a trunk and a silence that unnerved everyone. She was hired to cook, to feed the Holloways and their guests, to keep their world sweet and predictable. But within weeks of her arrival, sweetness turned to sickness. The youngest daughter woke screaming in the night, convinced someone was whispering through the walls. The patriarch's laughter turned violent, his appetite ravenous. Doctors called it a nervous fever. Servants called it something else, punishment. They said Mary Ann's food changed people. Her stews were thick, fragrant, unforgettable. Yet afterward, the air in the dining room felt heavier, as if words spoken there refused to die. Some swore that her meals tasted different to each person, bitterness for the proud, sweetness for the guilty, and nothing at all for the innocent. When investigators later opened her trunk, they expected jewelry, letters, or perhaps stolen silver. Instead, they found 13 jars, each labeled in delicate handwriting, names, dates, and faint traces of something preserved in murky liquid. No toxins were detected, but every jar carried the scent of lilac and ash. The Holloway children began to hallucinate. Mirrors in the house cracked. Guests left early, complaining that the food made them dream too vividly. The cook never denied the rumors. She simply said, "I serve what they hunger for." Modern psychologists might call it projection, the externalization of guilt. The Holloways were no strangers to cruelty. Whispers of unpaid debts, mistreated workers, broken promises to those who labored under their name. Baby Mary Ann didn't poison their bodies. Maybe she fed their conscience until it devoured them whole. By the time the sheriff arrived, the family's wealth was useless. Their heirlooms were pawned to pay doctors who could diagnose nothing. Every plate of food seemed to carry memory, resentment, and the taste of unfinished confession. The mansion eventually collapsed into ruin, overtaken by vines and silence, but travelers still speak of it. Some claim that when the evening fog rolls through those grounds, the scent of boiling stew drifts on the wind, thick and sweet, as though someone is still cooking for guests who never leave. This is the story of Mary Ann Holt, the woman who may have poisoned a family, or perhaps only revealed what was already festering inside them. The woman whose meals outlived her, whose recipes were written not in ink but in consequence, and whose kitchen fire, they say, still burns, somewhere deep beneath the soil of Georgia. There are stories that don't begin with a birth but with a wound. Mary Ann Holt's story was one of them. She came into the world in 1813, near the salt-stung marshes of coastal Georgia. Born not into comfort, but into contradiction. Her mother, Celeste, was a freedwoman who made her living selling herbal tonics to sailors and planters' wives, curing ailments their husbands' money couldn't. Her father, Ezekiel Holt, was a runaway preacher who believed sin could be burned, purged, or cooked away. That redemption was not found in the pulpit, but in the body itself. Together they made a strange kind of home, half chapel, half apothecary, where scripture was mixed with strange smoke, and where the smell of anointing oil blended with herbs drying above the fire. Neighbors called them the sinner's healers. Celeste's cures worked, but people feared her touch. They said she could see sickness before it showed, that she murmured to the roots before she cut them. Some claimed the marsh answered her prayers. When the fever seasons came and others fled inland, she stayed behind, her hands stained with salt and sage. Ezekiel, meanwhile, preached to anyone who would listen that God's light must pass through suffering to purify the soul. He believed every sin left a taste, metallic, sharp, that could be sweated or purged from the body. In that strange home, Mary Ann learned 2 languages, medicine and belief. She learned that every wound tells a story, and that stories, when left to rot, fester like flesh. But no child grows up unscarred in a house like that. By the time she turned 10, whispers had already started. People avoided the Holt shack. One sailor claimed to have seen a light moving under the water near their pier, as if someone was cooking beneath the sea. Another swore that Celeste spoke with the dead through bowls of broth left overnight. When the marsh fires swept through in 1825, the Holt home was the first to burn, a blaze so hot it left the surrounding reeds in glassy curls. Both parents perished inside, their bodies unrecognizable except for the faint smell of rosemary in the ashes. Mary Ann was found wandering barefoot the next morning, holding a jar of blackened herbs and humming the hymn her father always sang before sermons. She never spoke of the fire. What followed was a life of drifting. Plantations needed cooks, laundresses, and caretakers. Mary Ann could do all three, but what set her apart was her knowledge of healing. She knew how to break a fever, how to coax breath back into a drowning child, how to make a man confess by feeding him a certain root that loosened his tongue. Word spread quietly, as it often does when both fear and need are involved. In Savannah, hospital records describe a young mulatto woman with knowledge of medicine not taught by men. Her handwriting appears in the margins of an 1832 physician's logbook, correcting his dosage of quinine and suggesting an alternative, a tincture of feverfew and lemon balm. The doctor ignored her. His patient died 2 days later. Over the next decade, Mary Ann drifted inland. Everywhere she went, stories followed. At one plantation, a cruel overseer went blind after eating from her kitchen. At another, a mistress recovered from fever but became consumed by strange dreams. The pattern was always the same, healing intertwined with consequence, as if Mary Ann's remedies extracted not just illness but something deeper, darker. But what made her different wasn't just what she knew, it was what she believed. She once told a fellow servant, "Every sickness is a secret trying to leave the body." It frightened people, not because it was untrue, but because it wasn't. By the late 1830s, Georgia was a place divided by faith and fear. Preachers thundered about obedience while their congregations sought charmers in the woods. Mary Ann lived between these worlds, a ghost in broad daylight. For the white families who hired her, she was both a convenience and a threat, useful when illness came, suspect when it lingered. For the enslaved and the poor, she was a whisper of power, proof that the line between holy and unholy was drawn by those too frightened to see both. The Holloway family entered her story when she had nowhere else to go. Their estate lay 3 miles inland from Darien, surrounded by magnolia trees that smelled too sweet, almost rancid in the heat. The patriarch, Charles Holloway, was known for his temper and for his wealth, which came not from cotton but from speculation, buying and selling what others couldn't afford to lose. His wife, Margaret, was a woman of letters and lineage, proud of her bloodline, disdainful of imperfection. Together they had 3 children, Samuel, Eleanor, and Catherine. By the time Mary Ann arrived, the Holloway name had already begun to decay. Debts hung over the family. Their eldest son had failed at university. Their slaves had started fleeing in the night. The estate looked grand from the outside, but inside, the walls sweated with mold and resentment. Letters from their daughter Catherine still survive. One reads, "Father's patience grows thin. Mother prays for salvation, yet scolds the servants more than ever. The air feels heavy, as if it carries judgment." When Mary Ann first entered the Holloway kitchen, she noticed the silence. Servants whispered less, footsteps were soft, laughter non-existent. The family dined separately, husband and wife at one table, children at another. No household should sound that empty. She tried to do what she always did, bring warmth where there was none. She scrubbed the counters, gathered herbs from the estate garden, and prepared stews that filled the air with comfort. But comfort in that house turned quickly into suspicion. The mistress found her methods unsettling. Mary Ann refused to taste as she cooked, claiming that a cook's soul must stay clean of her master's appetite. She boiled roots the others couldn't name and muttered verses beneath her breath. She hung sprigs of bay leaf above the door, not as decoration, but as protection. Within days, mirrors began to crack. A clock stopped and would not restart. The children complained of hearing humming from the cellar. Mary Ann said little, but she began keeping her own notes. Fragments of dreams, snippets of conversation, recipes written like prayers. 1 measure of rue to still the tongue. 3 drops of molasses to sweeten grief. A pinch of salt to remember the sea. Her presence unnerved the Holloways because she didn't fit into their hierarchy. She wasn't submissive, but she wasn't defiant either. She existed on her own terms, and that alone was enough to draw hostility. Charles Holloway told guests she had strange notions. Margaret forbade the children from speaking to her. But Samuel, the eldest son, ignored that rule. He often lingered near the kitchen door, asking her about herbs and cures. Mary Ann humored him at first, explaining what each leaf did. But over time, their conversations grew heavier. Samuel confessed things, that his father was cruel, that his mother drank in secret, that the estate was drowning in debt. Mary Ann listened, but her silence wasn't passive. It reflected. People who spoke to her often left uneasy, as if they'd said too much. The first sign of what was coming arrived in a dream. Catherine, the youngest daughter, wrote in her diary that she dreamt of a woman standing over the family table, ladling soup that turned to blood as it touched the bowls. When she told her mother, Margaret slapped her and ordered the diary burned. Marianne never saw the diary, but that same week she began preparing a stew that smelled of iron and earth. The servants noticed changes. Birds stopped nesting near the kitchen windows. Dogs refused to eat leftovers. The house's mirrors, polished daily, began to tarnish at the edges. Margaret blamed humidity. Others blamed Marianne. It's here, historians say, that the story divides into two paths, one rational, one supernatural. The rational path says Marianne was a woman carrying generational trauma, using herbs and ritual to create a sense of control in a world that offered her none. Psychologists today might call it ritualized agency, a survivor's way of reclaiming meaning. The supernatural path says she inherited something from the marshes, a knowledge older than medicine, older than scripture, and that the fire that killed her parents was no accident, but consequence. Whatever the truth, by the summer of 1840, the Holloway household was unraveling. The children stopped laughing. Meals turned tense. Guests reported an unnatural heaviness in the dining room, as if every word spoken there cost something. Marianne's journal, discovered decades later in an attic chest, includes a single line written in uneven script. They feed on each other. I only set the table. It was as if she saw herself not as an avenger, but as an instrument, someone who revealed what people already were, and perhaps that's what frightened the Holloways most. Not the idea that she could poison them, but the possibility that she didn't need to. That supper, the one historians still argue about, marked the threshold between rumor and legend. No one can say for certain what she served that night. Some claim it was venison stew, others say rabbit. But everyone agrees that after that meal, the air in the house changed. Servants reported feeling dizzy, then euphoric. Margaret Holloway accused her husband of blasphemy during grace. Samuel began to cry for no reason at all. And Marianne, standing behind them, smiled. Not cruelly, but knowingly, as if a long-awaited truth had finally risen to the surface. The next morning, the youngest child fell ill. Fever, tremors, then silence. Doctors called it southern rot. Priests called it divine punishment. But to Marianne, perhaps it was neither. Perhaps it was inevitability. The poison that had always been there, brought finally to boil. Years later, when people tried to explain the Holloway tragedy, they always began here, with the arrival of the cook who carried herbs, hymns, and grief in equal measure. Some called her a witch, others a prophet, but all agreed. Once Marianne Holt crossed the Holloway threshold, something ancient awoke. Something that didn't come to destroy, only to reveal. And that supper, simple and ordinary on the surface, became the first course in a feast of reckoning. Because in 1840 Georgia, there were no therapists, no absolution, and no mercy for those who mistook guilt for grace. There were only secrets and supper. And Marianne Holt had learned long ago. Both could kill if served hot enough. The first to fall was Eleanor Holloway, age 9. The summer air was thick with the hum of insects and the slow decay of magnolia blossoms. Eleanor's laughter once echoed through the veranda like chimes, sharp, bright, and unbothered. But that sound vanished the week Marianne Holt took charge of the kitchen. It began subtly. Eleanor told her mother that her porridge tasted like coins. She said the milk had gone bitter, though no one else could taste it. By the third morning, she stopped eating altogether, insisting that shadows followed her spoon. She claimed they moved backward. Mirrors, she said, were lying. At first, her mother scolded her for dramatics. The Holloways were proud people. Weakness was not a language they spoke. But when Eleanor's gums began to bleed, and her eyes developed a faint gray hue, concern rippled through the household. The local doctor prescribed tonics and leeches, rituals of medicine that soothed nothing but custom. By the 7th day, Eleanor's hair began to lose its color. Strands of silver shimmered in her brush like threads of frost. Marianne, silent as ever, brewed tea in the kitchen below. She never explained what she added, only that it would settle the body and the mind. Dr. Linton arrived from Augusta 2 days later. His carriage wheels carved scars through the wet clay road, and his arrival drew every eye on the estate. He examined Eleanor under the flickering glow of oil lamps. His verdict, a case of nervous collapse, perhaps due to the heat or melancholy. He called for rest, prayer, and clean water. But rest did nothing. Prayer only deepened the silence. That night, Eleanor began to scream. Witnesses said the cries were not of pain but of fear, terror sharpened to the bone. She claimed something sat on her chest, whispering in her ear, telling her to confess. When her parents rushed in, they found her clawing at her own throat. By dawn, she was gone. The Holloways buried their youngest child beneath the willow tree behind the estate. The servants stood at a distance, heads bowed but eyes watching Marianne, who did not cry. She placed a single jar of wildflowers on the grave, whispered something inaudible, and walked back to her kitchen. 2 days later, the second child fell ill. Thomas, 11, began waking at odd hours, drenched in sweat. He spoke to corners, claimed he could hear his sister humming through the walls. When his mother tried to comfort him, he screamed, "She's not in the ground! She's in the food." The doctor returned, now visibly shaken. He demanded to inspect the kitchen. The servants obeyed, though reluctantly. When he entered, the smell was intoxicating. Spices, broth, something sweet but metallic. He found no spoiled ingredients, no signs of contamination. The pantry gleamed with precision. Every jar was labeled in Marianne's careful script: thyme, rue, marigold, ashroot. But among them, hidden behind the flour sacks, was a smaller shelf. No one remembered seeing it before. There, lined neatly, were 3 glass jars, each with a name written in chalk that could be easily smudged away. One name was already half erased. The doctor demanded to know their purpose. Marianne simply said, "They remember what others forget." Her calmness unnerved him more than any poison could. By week's end, Thomas too was dead. The Holloway matriarch, Delilah, began to unravel. She would wander the halls at night, muttering to herself. Servants claimed she refused to eat unless she saw Marianne taste the food first. Others said she burned every letter that came to the house, afraid that the words themselves carried disease. Then came the third death, Delilah's. Unlike her children, hers was slow. She grew paranoid, insisting that her husband was conspiring against her, that their home was rotting from the inside out. She accused Marianne of witchcraft one moment and begged her for healing the next. On her final night, she demanded one last meal, her husband's favorite stew. Marianne prepared it as ordered, humming softly. Witnesses recall her song was neither cheerful nor mournful. It was the steady rhythm of inevitability. Delilah took 2 bites. Then she froze. Her eyes went wide, her lips trembled, and she whispered, "It tastes like truth." Moments later, she collapsed onto the table, dead before her husband could rise from his chair. The following morning, the butler, Isaac, confessed that he had seen something he could no longer bear. He claimed that every night after the family slept, Marianne stood in the kitchen, stirring her pot with her bare hand. Not a spoon, not a ladle, her own flesh against the simmering broth. She whispered names into the steam. Sometimes they were Holloway names. Other times no one recognized them at all. When confronted, Marianne didn't deny it. She said, "Every name belongs somewhere. I only remind the stew who it serves." The master of the house, Charles Holloway, tried to dismiss it as superstition. But the more he tried to reason, the less reason seemed to hold. The servants began quitting one by one, terrified by the growing number of unexplainable events. The livestock refused to approach the kitchen door. Candles burned out faster when lit near Marianne's workspace. And the walls, according to several accounts, began to hum after midnight. One evening, the reverend from the nearby parish visited to offer comfort. He left pale, trembling, muttering that he had seen the shadow of intention, not of sin. Psychologists today might call it collective hysteria, a household infected by suggestion. Fear, after all, is as contagious as fever. But even by those terms, the Holloway case remains anomalous. Every surviving servant described identical hallucinations: the smell of blood in boiling water, whispers rising from empty pots, and the faint sound of a child's laughter coming from the pantry. Was it guilt? Was it grief? Or had Marianne tapped into something darker, the space between superstition and sanity, where belief becomes real through repetition? Modern analysts, looking back through the Holloway letters, note a disturbing pattern. Every victim who died had, at some point, benefited from the family's cruelty. Eleanor's toys were said to be bought from a widow evicted off Holloway land. Thomas's new room had once belonged to a servant's child, dismissed after an incident in the fields. And Delilah's wealth came from inheritances never rightfully hers. Perhaps Marianne hadn't poisoned them at all. Perhaps she'd merely fed them what they'd already been swallowing for years, their own moral decay, distilled and served hot. Still, even for skeptics, some details defy reason. The doctor's official report mentions no toxins in the bodies. Yet he wrote privately in his journal, "The air itself tastes of corruption." One night, two servants, Ezekiel and Ruth, snuck into the kitchen after Mary Ann had gone to bed. They wanted to expose her secrets. What they found would haunt them forever. The fire was still burning, though no one had tended it. On the counter sat a pot, not large, not small, but deep. Inside floated pieces of parchment soaked through. When Ruth fished one out, she saw writing, faint, curling, almost dissolved. The ink spelled names, dates, and verses from the Book of Lamentations. Before they could read further, the fire flared, nearly engulfing the room. They fled, but Ruth's hands bore burns that never healed right. After that night, both refused to speak of what they saw. The Holloway estate became a place of whisper and ritual. Servants left food untouched, fearing it might carry curses. Guests stopped visiting. Charles Holloway, desperate to restore order, fired Mary Ann, but she refused to leave. "I was hired to feed the family," she said softly. "The family isn't finished." Within a week, Charles himself began to change. He grew irritable, sleepless, obsessed with cleanliness. He accused everyone around him of deceit. He ordered every mirror in the house covered with cloth, convinced that reflections lied. One morning, the groundskeeper found him standing in the garden at dawn, reciting the Lord's Prayer backward. When the sheriff was finally called, he found Charles sitting at the dining table surrounded by untouched dishes. In front of him sat a bowl of stew, steaming though the fire in the kitchen had long since died. Mary Ann stood in the doorway, silent. The sheriff reported that Charles smiled faintly before saying, "It's strange how good it smells when guilt burns." Then he slumped forward, dead. No autopsy revealed a cause. His organs were intact, his blood normal. Only his tongue showed any mark, a faint gray stain as if brushed with ash. Mary Ann was arrested on suspicion of murder. She was calm as they bound her wrists. On the ride to the jailhouse, she said only one thing to the deputy beside her: "Don't feed them anything they didn't earn." The jailer's log shows she spent 3 nights in custody. On the 4th morning, the cell was empty. The door remained locked, the key untouched. All that was found was her apron, folded neatly with 3 dried herbs pressed inside: rue, marigold, and ashroot. The sheriff claimed she must have escaped through the window, though the bars were intact. Others whispered she had simply walked out, carried by whatever forces she had served. Weeks later, the Holloway mansion burned. No one ever learned how. But witnesses from the nearest town said that on the night of the fire, the air smelled not of smoke, but of stew. In the years that followed, those who tried to rebuild on the property met strange fates. Workers fell ill. One man claimed to hear a woman's voice asking, "Are you hungry?" before quitting on the spot. The land changed hands repeatedly, until no one dared live there at all. Psychologists now categorize the Holloway tragedy as a textbook case of psychogenic contagion, a shared delusion spreading through an isolated group. Yet even the most rational minds stumble on certain facts. No evidence of poison, identical symptoms across victims, and the inexplicable jars. 3 jars were recovered from the ruins after the fire. 2 had shattered. The 3rd remained sealed. Inside was murky water and a slip of paper. The writing, though faded, was still legible. It read, "The hunger always returns." In the decades that followed, local folklore renamed the Holloway estate the house that fed itself. Travelers swore that on summer nights the scent of broth rose from the weeds. Some claimed to hear a child's laughter, others the soft hum of a woman at work. To this day, the identity of the final name written in Mary Ann's last jar remains unknown. Historians debate whether she was a murderer, a healer, or something caught between, an interpreter of the rot that men refuse to see. But one truth persists. Every family that lived on that land afterward reported the same dream: a table set for supper, an empty chair at its head, and a voice whispering from the shadows, "Eat what's yours." In the end, it no longer mattered whether Mary Ann Holt had poisoned anyone at all. The Holloways were already sick with guilt, sick with greed, sick with the weight of what they'd taken. She had merely served it back to them, and somewhere beneath the soil where the willow tree still leans, the roots drink deep of everything they left behind. By the winter of 1841, the Holloway estate had become a mausoleum of whispers. The family's sickness had deepened into legend, and the once glittering manor now sat beneath a canopy of rot and rumor. The air itself seemed charged, as if every gust that passed through the cypress trees carried a secret. Neighbors claimed that on moonless nights a strange phosphorescence glowed from the windows, a soft pulse that looked like candlelight and felt like a warning. The tragedy had escaped the confines of the Holloway bloodline and spilled into the town's consciousness. People refused to cross the road that bordered the property. Wagons took the longer route through the marshes, rather than pass too near. What began as quiet fear soon erupted into public obsession. Everyone demanded an explanation. Was this an outbreak of disease, a punishment from God, or something older than either? The first voice to answer was Reverend Abel Crowther, the fiery minister of St. Elijah's Church. He was known for his sermonizing zeal, a man who saw Satan lurking behind every pleasure and virtue in every wound. From his pulpit, he thundered that Mary Ann Holt was no ordinary cook, but the vessel of Jezebel, the harlot of the kitchen, who had boiled sin into broth and served it with a smile. The townsfolk, already restless, clung to his words like gospel. Each week his sermons grew more feverish, more theatrical. Parishioners described how his hands would shake as he pounded the altar, sweat dripping down his temples, his voice cracking with rage as he painted Mary Ann not as a woman, but as a mouthpiece of hell itself. "She has bound sin through taste," he shouted one Sunday, "and every spoonful is a prayer to the devil." In his private journals, now locked away in the Georgia Historical Society, Crowther wrote that the first time he stepped inside the Holloway house, he knew something was wrong with the air. It smelled, he wrote, of iron and roses. The walls seemed to pulse like lungs. The cook stood in the doorway, silent, her eyes reflecting back every lie he had ever told. "When I asked her to pray with me," he recorded, "she smiled and said, 'I already have.'" Across town, Dr. Elias Linton of Augusta, the physician summoned to tend the Holloways, scoffed at such talk. Linton was a man of the Enlightenment, a physician who had spent time in Europe studying toxicology and the new science of neurology. To him, the preacher's claims were relics of medieval fear. He approached the case like an experiment, convinced that the Holloway family suffered from something chemical, tangible, and curable. His early notes, still preserved in faded ink, mentioned possibilities ranging from lead-laced well water to mercury contamination in cookware. He spent nights scraping residue from copper pots, testing the family's linens, even dissecting the family dog in a desperate search for answers. "Symptoms inconsistent," he wrote in one entry. "Periods of delirium punctuated by eerie lucidity. No vomiting, no convulsions, only mental unraveling. 'Cause uncertain. Environmental vector improbable. Perhaps hysteria." When questioned by locals about witchcraft, he laughed bitterly. "You cannot cast out a fever with scripture," he said, "and you cannot exorcise guilt with prayer." But his science offered no comfort when the evidence began to twist against him. Every sample he collected tarnished overnight. His tools corroded, his jars grew cloudy. He identified traces of Datura stramonium, the devil's trumpet, a hallucinogenic plant capable of inducing visions and amnesia, but never in lethal doses. "Unless," he scribbled in a margin, "it is not the body that is being poisoned." Still, he insisted on reason. "Fear," he told the sheriff, "is more contagious than disease." The preacher disagreed. To Crowther, fear was not the sickness but the cure. And so in February of 1841, faith and reason collided inside the Holloway dining room. Witnesses later swore the encounter changed both men forever. Crowther arrived clutching his Bible, Linton his notes, and between them stood Mary Ann, her apron immaculate, her gaze steady. "Confess what you've done," the Reverend demanded. She said nothing. Turning to the doctor, she asked, "Do you believe the body remembers?" Linton hesitated before replying that the body could store trauma but not memory. Mary Ann tilted her head. "Then you've never tasted memory," she said softly. The Reverend began to pray aloud, the doctor to take notes, and she merely stood between them as if she were both witness and judge. Later that night, each man wrote of feeling watched, though neither could say by whom. Within weeks, both would be dead. Reverend Crowther's death came first, sudden and spectacular. During a Sunday sermon, he convulsed mid-sentence, his spine arching backward, his voice warping into an inhuman rasp. He collapsed at the altar, frothing at the mouth, whispering something the congregation struggled to hear. Only the deacon nearest to him caught the words, "She feeds us still." Dr. Linton's death followed a fortnight later, quiet, but no less strange. He was found slumped over his desk, his fingertips blackened as though scorched from within. The autopsy revealed nothing, no toxin, no disease, no wound. His final note, unfinished on the page, read only, "The cure is belief itself." Their deaths tore the town in two. The faithful saw divine judgment, proof that the devil had claimed those who denied him. The skeptics saw coincidence, or perhaps self-inflicted poisoning born of stress. But one fact united them. Marianne Holt remained alive. In a time when even suspicion could be fatal, her survival was its own accusation. After her arrest, Marianne was confined to the county jail, a low brick building that smelled of lime and sweat. Sheriff Boyd claimed she prayed without sound, her lips moving but never uttering a word. When asked if she regretted her actions, she said, "I didn't poison them. I only fed their hunger." Newspapers branded her the Marsh Witch, but not everyone was convinced of her guilt. The Savannah Gazette ran an editorial suggesting that perhaps guilt itself could manifest as illness. If conscience can rot the mind, perhaps this woman's only sin was knowing the recipe. Yet the bodies continued to pile up, and fear demanded a scapegoat. Marianne's meals were prepared separately by guards. She refused to eat them. Weeks passed, but she did not lose weight. Her eyes grew brighter, her voice softer. "The kitchen never leaves me," she told a young guard who asked if she missed her work. When the Reverend's followers arrived to perform an exorcism, the candles they carried sputtered and died one by one. They left before sunrise, pale and trembling. Nearly a century later, the story drew the attention of Dr. Helen Murrow, a psychology professor from Emory University who specialized in mass hysteria. Her 1947 paper, The Holloway Affliction, a study in group psychosis, re-examined the event through the lens of guilt and repression. To her, Marianne Holt was not a witch but a catalyst. The Holloway's wealth was built on exploitation. Their moral corruption festered beneath the veneer of civility. Marianne's arrival, Murrow argued, served as a psychological mirror reflecting everything they sought to hide. She did not infect them, Murrow wrote. She revealed them. Yet Murrow's confidence faltered after she reopened the physical evidence. The infamous jars from Marianne's trunk, each labeled with names and dates, had been sealed for over a century in county storage. When opened under sterile conditions, every jar contained a faintly glowing residue. Chemical analysis revealed trace elements of human tissue, though none matched the Holloway family. The last jar, marked simply Abel, held a half-dissolved scrap of paper bearing 7 words. "I did not make him believe. He chose to." Murrow's assistant resigned the next morning, claiming to suffer night terrors. The lab closed quietly a month later. Modern scholars remain divided. Toxicologists point to datura, ergot fungus, or contaminated copper. Theologians cite scripture, invoking Jezebel and the wages of sin. Psychologists describe a perfect storm of repression, hierarchy, and hysteria. But none can explain why Marianne remained untouched. She exhibited no symptoms, no aging, no fear. The last record of her appears in the prison ledger dated June 12, 1843. Released due to illness unconfirmed. No grave was ever found. Rumors claimed she moved to the coast under a false name, opening a boarding house where guests dreamed of memories that weren't theirs. They spoke of food that tasted of sorrow and of lilac perfume drifting through the halls. The Holloway estate, long abandoned, became an obsession for investigators. In the 20th century, archaeologists excavated the site, expecting ordinary decay. What they found instead defied classification. The soil beneath the dining room tested rich in iron unlike any natural deposit. Geiger counters ticked faintly, though no radioactive materials were present. Some claimed the instruments reacted not to radiation, but to memory, as though the ground itself remembered the feasts held above it. Even today, visitors report the same scent Crowther once described, iron and roses, and the faint clatter of unseen cutlery when the wind is still. Science and superstition continue their tug-of-war over the Holloway mystery. To the rational mind, it must have been chemical, microbial, explainable. To the devout, it was a curse, a moral reckoning delivered by divine hands. Yet both explanations orbit the same unsettling truth. Marianne never ate. She served others but tasted nothing herself. Because, she once said during interrogation, I never needed to taste what they already were. Her words haunt the case file like a final diagnosis. The Holloways devoured themselves through guilt, Crowther through fear, Linton through pride. She merely set the table, and so the question lingers, decades and disciplines later. Was Marianne Holt a witch, a murderer, or something subtler, a mirror polished by suffering until it reflected the soul's decay? Perhaps she was the first psychologist in a world that burned women for understanding the mind. Or perhaps she was what Crowther feared most, a servant who refused to kneel. The truth remains a shifting boundary between laboratory and altar, between data and confession. Every attempt to define her collapses under its own certainty. For some, that uncertainty is unbearable. For others, it is proof that belief itself is the most dangerous poison of all. Even now, when historians gather to debate her case, anomalies occur. Audio recordings distort. Ink bleeds on fresh paper. Researchers fall silent, unable to explain the faint perfume that fills the room. Someone always mentions the smell, roses and iron, sweet and metallic. It lingers just long enough to make them question which side of the argument they're really on. Science or superstition, fact or faith, each chooses, and in choosing becomes part of the experiment Marianne Holt began nearly 2 centuries ago. Because whether she was healer or heretic, cook or conjurer, one truth endures. The Holloways ate what they craved, and what they craved destroyed them. Marianne Holt only served the meal. When the fire finally gutted the Holloway estate in the spring of 1842, only 2 souls crawled out from the smoke alive: Samuel Holloway, the eldest son, and Ruth, the housemaid. Both were found half-conscious near the garden gate, their faces streaked with soot, their eyes wild with something deeper than terror. They were taken to different places: Samuel to a relative's home in Augusta, Ruth to the small infirmary by the river, and neither would ever see the other again. Yet their words, preserved in letters, testimonies, and journals, became the fractured mirror through which history would forever view the Holloway curse. What truly happened in that house after Marianne Holt's arrest, no one could agree on. But both survivors left records, and both records contradicted each other in ways that made the truth feel not absent, but divided, split down the middle like a rotting beam in an old mansion. Samuel Holloway was 23 when the ordeal began. As heir to the family's dwindling fortune, he had been raised to believe himself untouchable. Those who knew him described him as polite but distant, a young man more at home among ledgers than people. When the sickness struck his siblings and parents, he first viewed it as divine punishment, then as coincidence, and finally as something he couldn't explain. In his official deposition to Sheriff Boyd, Samuel called Marianne Holt possessed of unholy arts, claiming she muttered in foreign tongues and collected strands of hair from the family combs. He spoke of seeing her stir the stew at midnight while whispering names into the steam, and of finding tiny dolls made from flour dough hidden behind the hearth. She looked at me once, he testified, and I felt like she could taste my thoughts. His voice reportedly trembled as he described the night of the final supper, the one after which his mother began screaming at her reflection, and his father locked himself in the study until dawn. She told me, Samuel said, that the meal would reveal us. I didn't understand what she meant until it was too late. Yet the same man who spoke of witchcraft in public wrote very different things in private. Among his surviving letters, kept by a college friend named Edward Kearns, are passages that contradict his testimony entirely. In one dated December 1841, Samuel confessed, "She showed me what my mother did to the workers. She said the soil remembers blood the way mouths remember sweetness. I could not eat without shame after that." The letter continues in a fevered tone. "She told me that sin has flavor, that some men crave it more than bread. I laughed, but when I tasted the stew that night, I swear it was as though I was chewing on guilt." Whether Samuel was hallucinating, confessing, or warning, no one can say. His handwriting grows erratic toward the end, and the last line reads, "I am still hungry, but not for food." By the time he wrote that, Samuel was already unraveling. Accounts from Augusta describe him pacing the riverbanks at night, muttering about voices from the kitchen and the scent of roses that followed him everywhere. He stopped eating solid food entirely, claiming everything tasted of metal. His cousin, Margaret Holloway, later told reporters that he sometimes sat by the fire stirring invisible pots with his finger, whispering to the flames. He said he was trying to finish what she started, she recalled. When Samuel finally died in 1847, found slumped in a tavern, a bottle of turpentine beside him, the coroner ruled it suicide by poison. But the barkeep swore he had seen no bottle, only a glass of water and a strange smile on Samuel's lips. He said it was finely cooked, the man told the local paper. Then he closed his eyes. If Samuel's account fed the myth of Marianne Holt as witch and murderer, Ruth's testimony fed its mirror image, Marianne as victim, martyr, or prophet. Ruth was 16 when she entered service at the Holloway estate, an orphan with no family name and no education beyond what the kitchen taught her. Her statement, given to the magistrate 2 months after the fire, painted a household of cruelty and hypocrisy. "They fed us scraps," she said, "and made her, Miss Marianne sleep beside the pantry where the rats were. The mistress threw her Bible in the fire one night after saying she didn't want slaves preaching in her house. But Miss Marianne pulled it from the coals, all burnt on the edges, and she said she'd rewrite what they burned. Ruth described nights of uneasy silence broken only by the sound of Marianne praying in the dark, not chanting, as Samuel claimed, but pleading softly, asking the Lord to forgive them before they choke on their own greed. When asked whether Marianne had ever cursed the family, Ruth shook her head. She never cursed, she said, but she cooked like she was talking to something higher. Ruth's recollections painted the kitchen not as a site of witchcraft, but of resistance. She said food remembers the hands that make it, Ruth told investigators. That's why she wouldn't let nobody else stir the pot. She said if someone mean touched it, it'd turn bitter. To the court, these were ramblings. To historians, they became evidence of a deeper psychological war, a power reclaimed not through violence, but through ritual. When the sheriff later searched the ruins of the kitchen, he found the burned remains of a Bible whose margins had been rewritten in ink and grease. Inside were verses replaced by instructions. A spoonful of sin, simmered until confession. Scholars still argue over whether this was metaphor, madness, or magic. Years later, a theological historian named Dr. Alan Crestwood analyzed the surviving pages and suggested that Marianne had created what he called culinary scripture, a blend of biblical rhythm and domestic rebellion. These were not spells, he wrote, but symbolic recipes for moral inversion. In a world where women and servants had no voice, the kitchen became her pulpit. Yet the superstition never died. Locals whispered that every meal Marianne prepared was a sermon disguised as supper. Eat and be known, one line from her rewritten text reads, taste and be judged. To the Holloways, perhaps that was the truest horror, that the act of eating itself became exposure, that nourishment could become revelation. Ruth's story should have ended with her testimony, but the record does not rest so neatly. In 1849, she vanished from the boarding house where she worked in Savannah. Witnesses said she had been talking about returning to the ruins of the Holloway estate to set something right. Weeks later, hunters found bones near the old kitchen well, small, female, and broken at the wrists. A rusted ladle lay beside them. The sheriff called it coincidence. The locals called it unfinished business. Some claimed they saw her ghost stirring an invisible pot by moonlight, humming the hymns Marianne used to hum. Others insisted the sound came from underground, a rhythmic tapping like a spoon against iron. By the late 19th century, the two survivor narratives, Samuel's fear and Ruth's faith, had hardened into folklore. Traveling preachers told the tale as a parable against pride and hunger. Newspapers romanticized it into a Southern ghost story. Psychologists of the new century reinterpreted both accounts as symptoms of trauma, the result of prolonged exposure to psychological manipulation. Dr. Alice Venn, a Freudian analyst writing in 1912, argued that Marianne Holt's meals represented catharsis through consumption, a way for repressed individuals to confront their guilt by literally ingesting it. Samuel could not digest his conscience, she wrote. Ruth, having none to hide, could. Her interpretation scandalized church groups, who accused her of pathologizing sin. But in the decades that followed, other scholars began to agree. The Holloway case was not about witchcraft, but about guilt devouring itself. Still, evidence kept interfering with theory. In 1923, workers draining the old Holloway well discovered something unexpected, a sealed ceramic jar preserved in mud. Inside were fragments of paper written in the same hand as Marianne's recipes. The words, though smeared and half erased, read, "Forgive what you swallow. It will forgive you back." Chemical analysis of the ink revealed traces of iron oxide, salt, and what one chemist described as a compound resembling blood serum. The jar was later lost in a museum fire. But photographs survive, showing script that looked both sacred and domestic at once, a prayer disguised as a recipe card. As the century turned, fascination with the survivors' testimonies only deepened. Filmmakers, folklorists, and criminologists revisited their accounts, each finding in them whatever they sought. Witchcraft, patriarchy, madness, trauma. A 1974 documentary titled The Taste of Sin juxtaposed Samuel's delirious writings with Ruth's gentler words, portraying the story as a Southern Gothic parable of guilt and grace. Psychologists interviewed for the film suggested Samuel may have suffered from psychogenic illness. his symptoms a mirror of collective guilt inherited from his family's cruelty. He was raised to consume, one expert said, and Marianne made him taste what that meant. Meanwhile, feminist historians reclaimed Ruth as a proto-activist, a symbol of enslaved and silenced women rewriting scripture to include themselves. She cooked her theology, one scholar wrote, and they called it witchcraft. But the past has a way of refusing to stay buried. In 2006, researchers from Emory University conducted a geochemical survey of the old estate site. Soil samples near the kitchen well showed abnormal magnetic readings, similar to those found in graves exposed to electrical storms. When night fell, equipment malfunctioned. Recordings picked up low-frequency hums described as indistinct vocal resonance. Locals who guided the crew insisted they smelled roses and metal, just as Crowther had a century and a half earlier. One researcher claimed to see a woman's silhouette by the tree line, holding a ladle that shimmered as though catching moonlight. "I don't believe in ghosts," he said later, but something wanted to be remembered. Today, the legend of the Holloway survivors lives on in retellings that blur fact and fiction. Samuel's name adorns a stretch of road near the ruins. Ruth's unmarked grave, if it exists, is lost to vines. Each represents a side of the human psyche, Samuel's collapse into guilt and Ruth's fragile resilience. Together they form a dialogue that refuses closure. One saw a witch, the other saw a saint. One starved from shame, the other prayed from compassion. Between them lies the truth, or perhaps the illusion of one. Modern psychologists use their case to teach about mass delusion, trauma transference, and the ways social hierarchies distort memory. Yet theologians still argue that what happened in that kitchen cannot be fully explained by science. Faith and fear are recipes with the same ingredients, one scholar wrote. It depends on who's doing the stirring. The Holloway story continues to invite both, simmering eternally between guilt and grace, logic and legend. And somewhere, beneath the soil where the estate once stood, the echoes of two survivors still linger, one seeking forgiveness, the other still stirring. For in the end, perhaps both Samuel and Ruth were right. Perhaps Marianne Holt was both witch and woman, both poison and cure. Perhaps she served them not death but revelation, the unbearable flavor of their own truth. And perhaps as the last embers of the Holloway house cooled to ash, those who lived carried not survival, but contagion, the memory of a taste they could never forget. At dawn on a windless April morning in 1842, the woman known as Marianne Holt was led to the gallows. The crowd gathered in the square of Darien, Georgia, claimed the air smelled faintly of roses and iron, a scent that had followed her since her arrest. Witnesses described her face as calm, her posture as prayerful. When asked for final words, she reportedly smiled and said, "Dinner is served." A hush fell over the crowd as the trapdoor opened. According to the official record, her body was later buried in unconsecrated ground. Yet rumors began before the sun fully rose. Some said her neck did not break. Others swore the rope itself began to smoke as if resisting its purpose. The sheriff who cut her down claimed her skin was cold but unburned. When they tried to cremate her remains, the fire sputtered out 3 times before taking. What little ash remained was scattered on the marshland wind, but locals whispered that it never settled. In the months following her execution, stories multiplied faster than summer flies. To the Holloway neighbors, the event marked the end of a haunting. To the townsfolk of Savannah and beyond, it was the beginning of one. Rumors spread that her ghost was seen along the coast, barefoot and carrying a wooden spoon. Children were warned not to answer when called to supper after dark, lest Marianne's meal find them first. Letters between parishioners and clergy from that year mentioned dreams of eating food that tasted of blood, of waking to the smell of broth though no fire burned. In the absence of fact, legend filled the silence, and like all enduring myths, it changed with the teller. In coastal fishing towns, she became a sailor's omen. Men out at sea spoke of a phantom feast that appeared on the waves during storms, silver platters floating on black water, each bearing a dish no man could describe the same way twice. Marianne's meal, they called it, said to appear to those guilty of betrayal. If a sailor saw it and confessed aloud, the storm would pass. If he kept silent, the waves would claim him. Records from the lighthouse at Sapelo Island in 1858 mention 2 separate crews lost after reporting visions of a woman stirring the sea. Even now, some shrimpers refuse to eat on their boats, believing the ocean remembers the cook who fed it guilt. But inland, among the ruins of the Holloway estate, the myth took a darker turn. Locals claimed that the air above the foundation would warm when someone spoke her name. Farmers said their livestock avoided the site. In 1869, a field hand reported finding bones in the soil arranged like cutlery. During the Reconstruction years, wandering preachers resurrected her story as a moral fable, a warning against vanity, greed, and the dangers of women who knew too much. Sermons depicted Mary Ann as a vessel of the devil, her kitchen a metaphor for temptation. One preacher, Reverend Isaiah Crow, told congregations that the devil's greatest trick was teaching a servant to feed her master's truth. His pamphlet, The Poisoned Table, became a local bestseller. Yet in the same decade, abolitionist writers in the North began reframing her tale entirely. To them, she was not a witch but a woman crushed under sin not her own. They described her execution as another form of lynching, a ritual meant to cleanse guilt through sacrifice. She did not curse them, wrote one essayist in 1872. She merely handed them the mirror. By the turn of the 20th century, Mary Ann Holt had become two figures, the witch who fed death and the saint who fed justice. Folklorists cataloged her as a Southern analog to Medea or Lilith, a feminine archetype born of repression and hunger. In 1908, Dr. Edwin Cartwright published a psychological study titled Feast of Shadows, arguing that the Holloway case represented collective transference, the projection of moral decay onto a scapegoat. When a society consumes suffering daily, he wrote, eventually it imagines the cook as the cause. His paper received ridicule from theologians, who insisted the documented events, the hallucinations, the deaths, the jars of names, could not be dismissed as metaphor. If the devil wore an apron, one critic replied, this is how he would serve. Religion continued to claim her as a cautionary ghost. In the early 1900s, rural Georgia churches began including her story in sermons about obedience and pride. Beware the servant who knows your sins, preachers warned. Sunday school children drew pictures of her as a black-eyed woman holding a pot full of flames. In some parishes, women were forbidden to cook during Holy Week, a ritual meant to close the kitchen against temptation. Even today, older congregants recall their grandmothers sprinkling salt before serving stew, a tradition they called Holt's Hand, meant to neutralize envy at the table. But beyond the sermons, another narrative simmered quietly through the decades. Folk healers and herbalists along the coast began referring to her recipes in whispers, claiming they carried hidden wisdom about the body and spirit. Some said her jars weren't curses but cures, each one a symbolic confession sealed in glass. The sickness wasn't from her food, one midwife told a WPA interviewer in 1937. It came from what they'd done, and she just made them taste it. To those who believed this, Mary Ann was a healer punished for feeding truth to those who preferred lies. Her death became martyrdom, her kitchen a temple. Then in 1976, the line between myth and evidence blurred once again. Archaeologists excavating the Holloway property uncovered a clay pot sealed with pitch beneath what had been the kitchen hearth. Inside was a dark residue resembling stew. Laboratory analysis revealed traces of Atropa belladonna, deadly nightshade, and brugmansia, or angel's trumpet, both hallucinogenic and potentially lethal. But the discovery grew stranger. Within the residue were 13 human teeth, each etched with initials too small to have been carved by hand. The markings matched none of the Holloway family, but seemed arranged in a pattern resembling prayer beads. The jar was dated to around 1840, the year Mary Ann began working for the family. Its contents challenged every theory. If the stew was real poison, why was she still alive when others died? If it wasn't poison, what explained the deaths? Some scholars insisted the jar had been planted, perhaps decades later, to perpetuate the myth. Others argued it was authentic, evidence of ritual cooking that blurred the line between medicine and morality. The discovery reignited debate across disciplines. Anthropologists interpreted the jar as a hybrid of African hoodoo and Christian symbolism, an act of reclamation disguised as domestic labor. Psychologists saw it as the externalization of trauma, a literal container for collective guilt. Forensic analysts, meanwhile, focused on the teeth. The etchings appeared to form letters, but the sequence made no linguistic sense. It's not language, one expert concluded. It's liturgy. The jar now rests in the Georgia Historical Archives, sealed in glass. Curators note that the pitch around the lid still emits a faint odor of lilac and rust. Through the 1980s and 1990s, scholars across fields, feminist theorists, cultural anthropologists, even theologians, revisited Marianne Holt's story. To feminist academics, she became an early emblem of resistance, a woman using the only power afforded her, nourishment, to rebel against those who owned her labor. Her poison, they argued, symbolized rebellion distilled into ritual. She seasoned justice with fear, one essay proclaimed, and forced them to taste it. In contrast, conservative theologians portrayed her as a warning from Scripture, a Jezebel figure cloaked in servitude. "The devil feeds through the humble," warned a 1982 sermon broadcast on Georgia radio. "He enters through the kitchen door." Between these interpretations, Marianne's image oscillated endlessly, witch or martyr, sinner or saint, never settling, always simmering. Pop culture soon followed. In 1993, a Gothic novel titled The Holloway Feast reimagined Marianne as a tragic anti-hero who poisoned her masters out of vengeance for her family's murder. The book's success spawned a small cult following, with readers forming midnight supper clubs that gathered to discuss morality, guilt, and the blurred line between justice and revenge. The author, historian Lila Brenner, later admitted she had based parts of the novel on her own research into the court transcripts and Marianne's letters, some of which have never been publicly released. "She wasn't evil," Brenner wrote. "She was hungry for dignity, for truth, for control over a life that never belonged to her." The film adaptation in 1996 transformed her into a Gothic icon, played with hollow eyes and an ever-simmering pot. The tagline read, "Every sin has a flavor." In the 21st century, digital forums and paranormal investigators revived the legend again. Videos circulated online of explorers visiting the Holloway ruins, claiming to hear the clink of utensils and smell spices on the wind. One widely viewed clip captured a faint voice on audio repeating the words, "Taste and be known." Skeptics dismissed it as pareidolia. Believers called it proof that the cook still stirred. Meanwhile, psychological researchers used her story in lectures on collective haunting, the way societies preserve unresolved guilt through folklore. "Marianne Holt is less a ghost," wrote Dr. Fiona Green in The Mind's Mirror, 2014, "and more a symptom of what the South could not digest." Yet, as new interpretations emerged, old fears refused to die. The local church in Darien still holds a midnight service every April 12th, the anniversary of her execution. They light 13 candles, one for each alleged victim, and serve bread without salt. Congregants must eat in silence. "To remind us that truth burns in the mouth," the pastor says. A few miles away, descendants of the Holloway servants maintain a different ritual. They cook a small pot of stew, let it simmer until dawn, then pour it into the river as an offering of peace. "She wasn't cursed," one elder explained in an interview. "She was teaching them to confess." In 2019, forensic historians reopened the case files after discovering a set of letters misfiled in the Savannah Courthouse archives. Among them was a correspondence between Sheriff Boyd and Dr. Linton, dated 2 weeks before the doctor's mysterious death. In it, Boyd confided his suspicion that Marianne was being framed. "I cannot prove it," he wrote, "but I fear the family poisoned themselves with what they had sown." The letter ends abruptly with a single line. "If truth can be cooked, then we are all eating lies." The revelation reignited debate yet again. Was Marianne a victim of hysteria and prejudice, or did she tap into something older, something that made the soul visible through sustenance? Modern theorists often point to one chilling consistency across every account. Marianne never ate her own food. Whether viewed as superstition or science, this single detail endures. Toxicologists argue it indicates deliberate poisoning. Psychologists interpret it as symbolic abstinence. She refused to ingest the corruption she revealed in others. Theologians call it sacrilege, the ultimate inversion of communion. "She fed them the body of their own sin," one pastor said on a podcast in 2022, "and they crucified her for the taste." Today, the Holloway kitchen remains untouched. The surrounding forest has reclaimed the land, but the stone foundation persists, moss-covered and stubborn. Visitors report that compasses fail near the site, and recordings pick up a low hum like breathing. The Georgia Historical Society forbids excavation, citing preservation laws and superstition. Locals still avoid the area after dusk. "It ain't haunted," one groundskeeper told a reporter. "It's just still cooking." Fact or myth, history or haunting, the truth of Marianne Holt's story continues to resist digestion. She exists somewhere between science and superstition, guilt and grace, sinner and saint. Each generation adds another flavor to the tale, seasoning it with its own fears. Perhaps she was framed by a family collapsing under the weight of its own cruelty. Perhaps she was a healer punished for her defiance. Or perhaps she was something far rarer, a mirror polished so clean that when others looked upon her, they saw what they had done and called it evil. And so her legend endures, not because of what she did, but because of what she revealed. That even the purest meal can taste of sin when the eater refuses to face themselves. The Holloway kitchen stands silent, yet its air remains thick with memory. Rose, iron, and something sweeter, darker, unexplainable. And somewhere, perhaps in the shifting heat above that ruined hearth, a voice still whispers what she said at the end. Dinner is served. The Holloway estate is gone now, devoured by vines, silence, and time itself. What was once a grand plantation kitchen has dissolved into earth and moss, its bricks swallowed by the Georgia soil. Yet locals insist that when the wind slides through those ruins, it still carries a scent both comforting and terrible. Stew and sorrow, iron and roses. Travelers who wander too close speak of sudden nausea, as though something unseen is trying to be remembered through them, as if memory itself hungers to be digested. For historians, the Holloway tragedy remains a puzzle of contradictions. The documented evidence ends in ambiguity. No proven poison, no consistent testimony, no confession. What endures is not clarity but contradiction, the perfect fuel for myth. Psychologists call it a textbook case of moral projection. A family so steeped in guilt that they summoned a scapegoat to embody their rot. Theologians, however, call it divine irony, that a servant's hands delivered the justice her masters denied. To skeptics, it is folklore born of fever, ignorance, and class decay, a Southern Gothic parable about fear devouring reason. Each explanation feels right until it doesn't, as though the truth keeps changing its flavor depending on who's tasting it. Perhaps that's why Mary Ann Holt's story has never faded. It exists not in graveyards but in kitchens, in every simmering pot that conceals a secret, every recipe whispered instead of written. She is invoked, sometimes without name, whenever someone says that food carries emotion, or that love and hate can season a meal the same way. Modern scholars describe her as an early metaphor for feminine rebellion, the domestic alchemist who turned servitude into subversion. Preachers still warn of her as a Jezebel who weaponized care. But somewhere between those extremes, between witch and martyr, breathes something more human. Hunger. Not for flesh, not even for vengeance, but for freedom, the most forbidden meal of all. The legend's persistence speaks to something deeper than superstition. It endures because it asks an unbearable question. What if evil is not something we consume, but something we create? What if Mary Ann never poisoned anyone, but simply made them taste themselves? Their greed, their cruelty, their unspoken guilt simmered into form. Such a possibility frightens more than any ghost, because it means the haunting isn't in the ruins, it's in us. And so the Holloway kitchen remains untouched. Beneath the moss and dust, perhaps one final jar still waits, sealed with pitch and patience, preserving the last unspoken truth. Maybe it holds only dirt and water. Maybe it holds the reason no one dares to dig. The wind still stirs there, carrying a faint whisper across the fields, soft, distant, almost tender. Dinner is served.